Hello, strangers. Welcome to Neon Static, where once a week we broadcast one true, scary story you won't hear anywhere else. I am your host, Vi, and I bring you a story today from the past, the 1990s. This is story 116, and it goes like this. This was back in the early 90s, a few years into my policing career. I was out of my rookie years by then. I'd been assigned to a beat with my partner, Humes. At this point, I felt like I knew what I was doing. DVs, B&Es, even a peeping Tom case earlier that year. I'd seen it all. I had that sort of self-confidence in my step to replace the previous squeaky shoe nerves of my first few years wearing the badge. Now, it was a rural city. While the population was large enough for the city description, it was spread out over the rolling hills of countryside and farmland. A city on paper, but in practice it felt like hamlets loosely connected by snaking long streets that cracked and sprouted pockets of wild grass over the years. So when I say criminal element, I don't mean anything so organized as the mob. Just the usual suspects. Frequent flyers, as we'd call them. Every little pocket of that scattered city had one or two. For example, if you were to head over to the Boom Boom Room on the call of a bar fight, well, you'd see Walt Thompson there. And he knew us, too. He'd sidle up after the cuffs were on, and he'd usually be good for a witness statement with the right incentive. A couple of bills for his bar tab. We'd get his statement into our little notebooks, and he'd have his evening drinks all sorted. Very step right up, everyone's a winner. Humes had been on with the force longer. He introduced me informally as we'd meet other locals. He knew all the prosts, or streetwalkers. As it turns out, you can't get a better confidential informant, or CI, than a prost. The ones that last long enough to be frequent flyers do so by one of two ways: plain luck, or honing quick study observational skills. After all, they had to know at a glance at the way a man edged his car to the curb if they were friend or foe. When it came to tip-offs, they were more than reliable. I wouldn't say we became friends, though. We still had to run one or two in on occasion. Over time, though, we learned that if we had to come down heavy, we did so in winter. See, the town had brutally cold winters. Not much snow, but the dry wind felt like it went through your pores and set your bones to ice. And those girls, they were advertising. Parkas don't do much to showcase your wares in that line of work. It got so they'd already be approaching us as we'd pulled up some nights. They'd clutch the door handles to the back seat expectantly, like picking up teenagers from the mall. They'd clamber into the warmth of the car, and we'd take a drive downtown to check them into the drunk tank to sleep it off. The it being the nips of pocket flasks, maybe something harder, but sometimes it was just the winter itself. I think it was things like that that made them trust Humes and I a bit more. I got to know many of them, and Rhoda Phipps was one of the girls I knew the best of them. Hell, we all knew Rhoda. She was a regular. A regular what? I won't say, Humes would laugh. She'd been in town for years. At first, I took her for one of those quick study girls to explain how she'd lasted that long. Over time, though, I watched life chip away at her, taking the paint off. Her face grew hard, and she seemed to shrink down, boiling into wiry rawhide. Her hair, as if in compensation, grew bushy and bouffant. It was always in some varying hue of red, the whole range. It was I Love Lucy tomato orange one week, and then a gothy Merlot purple the next. And if anything went down in the east of our city, it was likely that you'd see that wild red beehive bebopping along behind a parked car or a hedge. and you'd know that another piece of the story could be yours. For a price. Sometimes that price was a couple of bucks. For the hair dye fund, Humes would say. Sometimes it was a drive downtown to the tank to get out of the weather. I remember her falling asleep back there more than once on one of those winter taxi rides. For all of her weathered, harsh appearance, I was surprised to see that in sleep, Rhoda looked far younger than she was, in the affect of a child who'd fallen asleep on the ride home, her lips parted in a silent snore. That said, dealing with Rhoda wasn't always fun. The girl had a mean streak in her, and the cigarettes she chain-smoked lent her cutting comments a gravelly, nasty sting. She'd give you tips or tell you what she saw, provided, of course, she felt like it. Sometimes she felt her time was better spent insulting you, your job, your husband or wife, and your performance with your husband or wife. And you'd have to stand there and take it, hoping once she felt she'd lashed out enough, she might just cough up something besides phlegm. The times that we got her into the car when she was in a mood, she'd laugh that rusty, wheezy laugh, curse us out by our mother's names or worse, and over time, it got old. The novelty of being told that your mother is any number of leprous beasts will do that. It also got worse. One night, some missionary group had gone down to the east side. Typical do-gooders. They'd try to round the girls into one of their programs periodically, get them a room, a job, maybe even a few classes at the community college a way out. Well, they'd come up on Rhoda and startled her, and she'd gone so far as to grab one of the missionaries right in the pants. It was a kid. He was barely 14. He'd cried, was still crying when we pulled up. Rhoda was in her mood, cackling and pacing. Every so often she'd lunge at where the kid sat on the curb, surrounded by the pastor and his staff protecting the kid. We rolled her up, but even still asked her what had happened, in case there'd been some sort of instigation and she was being painted as a villain, unfairly. Well, she just laughed, all raucous and unhinged, bragged about it as we cuffed her and put her in the car. It had gone down just as described. But even then, she wouldn't speak. Rhoda had that evening decided her words were too valuable to share with the likes of us, even the ones insulting us. So she sat in the back and began spitting at us. This is before they started putting plexiglass between the two compartments. She was trying to hawk loogies at us through the mesh. We threatened her with a face mask, but she just kept on spitting, glee and mania glittering in her eyes. The shock on her face when Humes pulled over sprang open the door and put it on her, though. Those same eyes no longer twinkled with mirth. They bugged out over the Hannibal Lecter-style mask in shock. And then came the kicking and the screeching. The spit was contained, but the sound of her was like barn cats in heat. She genuinely hadn't been able to tell it was coming, though. It was shock on her part. And that's the night I realized that Rhoda was not one of the girls who'd made it this far by being a self-trained observer. Aside from some new chemical refreshments she'd found and promptly hooked herself on, per a talk screen at lockup, Rhoda was one of the rarer girls who ran on blind luck. Like a cockroach, I thought. I was mad as hell at her, at the diseases she no doubt attempted to loogie at us, at that poor kid she'd grabbed and scared half to death. I was madder than her than I'd ever been, at any prost or burglar or mugger. She was 1,000% wrong here, to the point of getting so out of her mind on whatever drugs she was on that she assaulted a child. But there was no remorse, no regret. She laughed about it. That rage simmered in me the whole night. It was only placated by one thought. The girls that ran on luck? Well, they lasted longer than you'd think. But they never lasted forever. Good, I thought. But then came that night. The night of the event, Humes and I were patrolling the east quadrant of the city. There wasn't much to see or do. The temperature had dropped to a stiflingly cold 10 degrees Fahrenheit, and that was before the wind chill merrily took it down another 20. Worse, it had snowed earlier that day. The wondrous white fluff had turned ashen gray upon contact with the streets, and the wind had solidified it into dirty ice. There were no calls. It was too cold for crime. Humes was driving, careful as the car occasionally slipped over a patch of ice. He'd shake his head at each burst of static as someone would key their radio. It was like he was forbidding anyone from summoning us to a call, a scene, anything that would necessitate him pulling over. "Don't you dare," he'd mutter, as another call would come in. Of course, he jinxed it, because with a rush of static, we heard 3643, our call sign, read out by the dispatcher. I grabbed the mic as Humes cursed. I gave it a beat and then keyed it to respond. The dispatcher came back, advising us of a 1232 a few blocks from where we skittered around another icy corner. 1232, intoxicated person. An ambulance had been dispatched, but in case the person was drunk, stoned, or otherwise running on something, we were to show up and see to things. Hume said that they'd have to be out of their gourd to be out in this. I keyed in again, responding that we were en route and asking for any description. What I heard back gave me a chill so harsh it was like the window had been rolled down. The person was lying down, covered in snow. The caller only identified it as a person because its feet stuck out from beneath the lump of snow. I looked at Humes, who was no longer cursing but looking back at me. Intoxicated would explain laying down in this cold, out in the elements. But so could a couple of other, worse things. Much worse. He hit the lights, and we slid our way over to the next street, then the next, where we saw a small crowd had gathered in spite of the freezing cold. Humes pulled to a stop. I was the first out, taking care to stomp March over so that I wouldn't slip and fall in my 40 pounds of police gear. As the crowd scattered, my heart fell in my chest. The person wasn't laying down in an alley or even butted up against one of the walls of the storefronts that lined the street. They were in the gutter, toes pointing down, face down. Worse and worse. I leaned over the shape and began swiping my hands over the snow. Some of it came up in clumps, some in chunks of ice. I began to ask myself how long had this guy been, and my hand swept over a chunk of white ice. It came off, exposing a pile of ratted, cherry red hair. It was an instant punch to my gut. No. I called out Hume's name. I told him to grab the shovel, grab the blankets. He responded something sarcastic. As I'd headed right for the still form in the gutter, he'd rounded to the boot of the patrol car, already retrieving the shiny space blanket and small shovel. I cut him off. "It's Rhoda!" I looked at him, just to see my words connect. His face blanched, and I turned back. I was digging frantically, beginning to speak to her. Rhoda, come on, girl. Come on, you old cow. Don't be..." More and more of her came into view. The back of her coat, a men's woolen overcoat, moth-eaten and shaggy from years of wear. Her legs, wearing nothing more than torn pantyhose, something that made me cry out in frustration. Pantyhose! It's 20 below, you stupid... But my thoughts cut off, as though thinking ill of her, insulting her, even as awful as she could be. I was struck that there was a panic bubbling up in my throat, a wild, clawing panic that translated to my hands as I dug at her, trying to clutch at something more than her torn clothes to pull her free from where she'd literally frozen into the ground. Humes was at her head. One of his big mitts swept another flurry of powdery snow off of her, and we finally saw her profile. She had a straight button nose over a full upper lip that seemed cartoonish, larger than her bottom lip. She'd turned her head to the side, looking left, out to the street, before passing out. Another bolt of something sharp and horrible threw me. Her lips were parted. In that moment, she again struck me with her resemblance of a child asleep. Humes pulled one of his gloves off and thrust his fingers at her pulse point on her neck. He paused. The lines of his face deepened in a frown, and then flattened in resignation. Humes looked at me. His hand slowly slipped from her. "No." I yelled at him. "What are you doing? Dig her out. We need to get her breathing." And again, without a word, his look told me there was no use. I yelled again, sound, not words, and I kept digging at her, finally getting my hands jammed underneath her, between her and the ground. Her own body heat had melted the ice here. I sat back on my heels and I leveraged her up and out of the icy crust. I was still yelling words but not hearing them. Humes did. They must have been intelligible. He was already shoving the blanket under her body. We lifted her up and onto the sidewalk. We rolled her so her back now lay flat against the blanket. I wrapped the sides of the blanket around her, rubbing my numb hands up and down her arms. The metallic, foil-like blanket was crinkling as I tried like hell to use friction to heat her, to warm her back up. Humes was at my side, muttering again. He put a hand on my shoulder, but I shook it away. I told him, "Get her legs, rub them, we have to get her warmed up." He sighed, but nonetheless he sidestepped to her legs and, folding the blanket over them, began shuffling his hands up and down the same as I did over her arms. I kept looking at her face. The panic wasn't subsiding. I noted that the ice under her cheekbones, her hollow cheekbones, I knew she was getting smaller, but I'd never noticed how much she'd shrunk. Well, there were crystals there, on the skin, patterned like snowflakes. And they weren't melting. The ambulance came at some point. I had lost any sense of time. One minute I was feeling her body break free of the ice, come loose in my arms, and the next the wee-woo wagon was there and I was being hauled away from her, watching them lift her body like the blanket held nothing at all. They laid her onto their fold-out gurney. Her nose and lips, still too pale, were covered by that breathy, squeezy cup they always have. They loaded her into the back of the ambulance. As the doors slammed closed, I again felt Hume's hand on my shoulder. I turned, and I looked him dead in the eye. He sighed, but he didn't say a word. Not as we got back into the car, nor as we followed the ambulance, which means I saw when the lights, flashing cherry red, turned off 2 blocks away from the hospital. My heart stopped. I thought, hers too. That's the only reason they ever turn them off mid-ride, when there's no point in rushing. We parked the patrol unit. Humes made the call back to the station this time. The heater was on full blast. At first I thought I was sweating. Then, as I wiped my forehead, my hand came away dry. I wiped my cheeks. I realized that, without a single hitch or sob, my eyes were running tears. Humes was glancing at me, alternating between concerned and confused. Me too, man. Rhoda wasn't kind. She wasn't my friend. She wasn't a hooker with a heart of gold. If she had a heart, that withered ball of tar beat only to cause trouble and fuel her endless sarcasm and spite. She'd been helpful, sure, when she felt the urge. God knew why, maybe because whoever she had tips about had crossed her, and this was revenge. But she was just as likely to sneer in your face, use it as a spittoon, as she was to say good morning. All I could think was, I'm a cop. Seasoned, so I think. But I'd never seen someone I knew, someone I saw day to day regularly, die. That wasn't supposed to happen. I was supposed to drive around and stop bad things from happening to people in this city. My city. My people. She was one of my people. Seeing her tough-as-nails skin broken, and how frail she was underneath, all I could think was, I failed her. We sat in the car for a while. They'd unloaded her with no rush, and I shuddered when I saw that they'd taken the time to put her into a bag, maybe even done so en route. The bag was near flat, save at the end where I knew the blocky toes of the snow boots were stuck straight up, tenting the material. I didn't cry out, but I felt a fresh flood of wet cascade down my cheeks and nose. Humes kept clearing his throat. Women crying always made him feel uncomfortable. He finally opened his mouth and began to say something, but I cut it off. "We better get in there." I turned to him, wiping my face, my voice eerily calm even to me. "We need to see if that was self-induced. Maybe someone got to her, knocked her down." My partner hesitated. "Be hard to say. A fall in the gutter is going to look like a fall, regardless of why she fell." I could see he didn't want to, and that clashed with the feeling of failure in my chest. I told him, good thing the city pays us to investigate these things, so we can know for sure then, right? Humes looked at me sharply then. I knew I'd offended him, but at that moment I was offended. At him, at that crowd of onlookers who'd gathered to gawp at her, but not lifted a finger to help her. Rhoda truly had no friends, not even amongst the people she saw every day on the street. And I was offended with her. Damn it, Rhoda. You had one job, and that was to not die. But if I'm honest, I was the most offended and angriest at myself. We went inside. Slow day for crime, even slower for the morgue. When we made it in, the two working the cold room looked at us, then took in the uniforms. The coroner I recognized. She was a nice but no-nonsense brunette. She always wore pastel. That day, it was lavender. Her assistant, also a woman, was thinner, taller. She carried herself with a world-weary face that didn't match her age. She looked like a bored teenager. They had the bag on the operating table. They'd been setting up their little side table of tools. The light in the morgue that day was too bright. The tools seemed to glimmer and glint like those 1950s ads with the fake little white stars to indicate clean, new, fresh, now with added riboflavin. Everything was wrong. This was no exception. And I didn't want to be there. For all my pushiness with Humes, seeing Rhoda's face again, would it still be frozen in that lip part? Would she still look like a child asleep in the back seat? Or would it have melted, gone slack in that awful, old rubber mask way that faces took on when they... My mind was stuttering, blanking, even as my eyes locked on the assistant's hands as she reached out and pulled the zipper on Rhoda's bag. 3 things happened all at once. "Well, shall we get started?" asked the coroner to no one in particular. The tick-tick-tick of the zipper whizzing open as the assistant drew it down. The black tarp-like material parted, exposing the tip of a white button nose, the jut of a defiant chin. And at once, the face erupted from the bag as Rhoda sat up bolt upright, the fastest I'd ever seen the old girl move, her eyes bugged out, her mouth gaping open as she took a yelling gasp of air. I lied. 4 things happened, because while he hates every time I bring this up, the 4th was Humes. Humes leaping away like a girl who'd seen a mouse, shrieking, "Mary, Mother of God!" as he slammed backwards into another examination table. And I do tell this story often, because it remains the scariest night I've had as a peace officer to date. Because, no, Rhoda was not patient zero of a new zombie movie heralding an apocalypse, nor was Rhoda some immortal. This night was not one woman's in-person encounter with a higher being before the glory of their countenance liquefied her retinas into strawberry jello. Rhoda had taken enough of something to pass out. In the cold, her heartbeat had slowed, her respiration too, but it hadn't stopped. And when my partner had put his near-numb fingers on her neck, he'd been unable to detect her pulse. But once we'd gotten her warmed up, first in our hands, then in the ambulance, and then in the bag, which acted to sort of blanket her in her own body heat, well, Rhoda had woken up. No, the scariest part of this story is regret. I'd been so proud of myself, my jaded, seen-it-all attitude. I'd been judgmental and nasty. I'd put on my uniform, I'd gotten into my car that said "Protect and Serve" on the door, and I'd looked at Rhoda, high out of her mind on some drug that ran amok in her brain, caused her to get worse, her actions to snowball. She'd had no friends or family to help her, to tell her to watch out, to knock that stuff off before it went too far. And I'd thought to myself, cheered myself, that her luck would run out. Well, my luck gave me a glance into what it would look like if that came true. It was only for a few hours, but it's the thought of living with that guilt that fills me with terror to this day. And that is story 116, a retelling of a story I heard about in childhood. In case you haven't put it together, my parents were indeed cops, and not the only cops in my family, so I've come by a lot of these stories since I was very young. Maybe too young. I'm sure it's fine. Look how well I've turned out. I might be doing an announcement later. I assume you do those on the community tab. You know, for doing this for nearly 2 years, I'm actually pretty terrible at YouTube. But expect something new coming soon. Of course, in addition to every Tuesday at 3, when you can expect another one of these. If you like it and you want to hear more, subscribing helps with that. If you have a story yourself that you'd like to share, comments below or social media in the description. Liking is always appreciated. I see every one of them. But honestly, I'm just so happy y'all tuned in. There are so many of you. Where did you all come from? Until next time, do stay strange, and do stay safe. And take care, strangers.